So if we're unmuted, can the folks at home just let me know if you can hear me? So maybe.
I can hear you.
All right, thank you, Ben. Appreciate that. For the folks at home, the materials we have for tonight, in addition to being on the screen, are pinned in the comments. For those of you here, if anyone wants a copy of the presentation, we have materials up here as well. I think most of you know me. If you don't, my name is Tony Mazzucco. I'm the town manager here in Norwood. This is our town meeting information session. A little bit different than what we've done in the past. We are focusing just on land use this March. We're trying to move our town meeting to being roughly 3 times a year, roughly 1 to 2 nights a year. And putting land use sort of in its own category because it is a little bit complicated and it becomes very distinct from trying to adopt a budget, a bylaw about curfews or something like that, as well as some of the other businesses we come to. So it allows us to sort of focus all of our intention on land use. I'm going to introduce a couple of people. This is Sarah Dixon, who is our Director of Community Development for the town, our Planning Director. We have Ernie Pachkowski from the Planning Board here. Mike and John from my office. Most important, our moderator is here as well, Madam Slater, and Gary Pelletier, who is our building commissioner, who does zoning enforcement, which we'll talk a little bit about. We have a couple of other officials here from the Finance Commission, but I can't name everyone in the room. But thank you for being here. I'm going to start off with just a quick review of just an overview of zoning and land use. It's something similar that we started last year just to kind of frame our conversation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to go through the 6 articles that are on the warrant for this March. I promise I will be brief. So what does zoning actually do? When we talk about zoning, what a zoning bylaw does is it actually regulates how we use land, what is allowed to happen on that land, some of the dimensions of it, roughly how big it can be, and how much of that land it can take up. The actual parameters of how a building is built is contained in the building code, but we can say it needs to be X feet from the road. It can take up Y space on a plot. It comes from the state's zoning law. So municipalities in Massachusetts are political subdivisions of the state. We're what's known as a Dillon's Rule state, which means we don't have the authority that the state legislature grants to us as a city or town. Even though we have a charter, even though we have home rule, it's actually limited home rule in Massachusetts, which just means everything we do has to be consistent with state law. We can sometimes go a little bit beyond it, but we can't do less than what the state requires. And ultimately, all of our zoning, as well as all of our bylaws, have to be approved by the state. Now, they don't make a decisional basis. If we decide that, we want these parcels to be residential, they're not going to say, well, we disagree. We think they should be commercial. But it has to be consistent with state law for us to be able to enact any zoning, as well as any of our general bylaws. So the example that we use there is we could require more affordable housing in the state. We could not require less than the state. Any zoning we pass also goes to the Attorney General for a very detailed review. It actually sometimes can take up to 6 months to get back from the Attorney General approval for our zoning. And again, we can copy something that's been done in 15 other towns exactly. We can have 9 lawyers look at it. Everyone can be certain that it's perfect. The AG still spends a couple months reviewing it, and then they will still send back any comments. If there's something inconsistent with state law, they will reject it, sometimes in whole or in part. So that's another important step to our zoning, that anything we choose to do locally, the Attorney General directly reviews and approves whether or not it can actually be enacted as our zoning. So that being said, what is zoning? It is a regulation of what you can do and where. The easiest way to think about it is zoning is broken up into zones where you're roughly saying what you can do in different areas. Mike, just let me know if there are any comments. I can't. Okay, awesome. I didn't know if it was just somebody logging in or not. Sorry. So you'll notice we have a number of different zones in Norwood. And the basic concept of zoning is businesses go in one place, homes go in one place. You don't always mix the two, except sometimes you do. Industry should be over here. But the zone that you're in dictates what you're able to do with a particular piece of property. I know that sounds as a strict restriction on your property rights, and in reality it is. You own a single family home in a subdivision, you're not allowed to build a McDonald's on that single family home. Same thing, you own a McDonald's downtown, you're not allowed to put a single family home there. When we talk about regulating uses, that comes through a use chart. So we can't list out every possible use, but zoning tries to list out all general uses and all sort of specific uses and anything like that. So we may not regulate a shoe store and a hat store differently, but that's retail. We generally know what it is. Are there discussions that happen sometimes where somebody says, well, this isn't this type of retail? Absolutely. Sometimes that goes to the building enforcement, the building commissioner to enforce. Sometimes it becomes a zoning issue. Sometimes it becomes a legal issue. Usually it's not a problem if it's a hat store versus a shoe store, but then people start getting into different types of businesses. The service business is a retail business. It can get a little complicated. The more detailed your use chart is, the better you're able to sort of head off those problems before they become issues. Just as a simple example of how a use chart works, right here you have, these are different types of retail uses. You have a drugstore. Obviously, in a single family home zone, you're not going to allow a drugstore. So again, typical residential subdivision, you're not going to allow somebody to just build an Osco drug in the middle of that. When we talk about regulating dimensions, we talk about the frontage of a lot. That's a term we use quite a bit. Does your lot have access to a street and does it have access on the road? How much of your lot you can take up? And again, you'll notice that zoning is always supposed to be looking forward. We don't have a lot of open land, so anytime we do something, we're sort of putting a zoning code in. An existing building does not have to meet that new code for zoning. That's what we call a pre-existing use. So that's why you might say, geez, you know, my neighborhood's supposed to have a 15-foot setback, and I know a bunch of houses that have only a 10-foot setback. Well, when were they built and when was the zoning code in there? Zoning also doesn't generally look back, it only looks forward. So if we allow retail in one lot and we decide to change that, but you're already operating a store, you're allowed to continue operating that store. Generally in perpetuity. We can set parameters to side yards, front yards, backyards, heights of building, and then when we talk about things like open space or floor area ratio, a rational decision on how much space of your lot you're allowed to take up. So how do we actually make these zoning rules that we want to do? The planning board takes the primary role in that. All zoning changes have to be referred to the planning board to have a hearing, and then they make a recommendation thereof. Ultimately, it goes to town meeting. And then town meeting says yes or no, and then from town meeting it goes to the attorney general to decide if the zoning is in fact legal. So what about enforcement of zoning? So I've said you can't build a McDonald's on your property, but you try to build a McDonald's on your property. What happens? Well, we send the building inspector out. And the reason being that in state law, the building inspector is the person responsible for zoning enforcement. And he would go and he would issue an enforcement order and say, you know, please, you're not allowed to build a McDonald's there. It's rarely that simple and straightforward, unfortunately, but that's how it would happen. It more or less comes, you're building a deck, you've got a permit to build your deck, you can only go up to 5 feet, and the building commissioner assigned you to go 5 feet, but one of the neighbors calls you and says that you've gone a little bit further, something like that, then it becomes a zoning issue. Honestly, probably what Gary, half the zoning issues are people just doing things without checking the rules. If not 3/4 of it are people just go ahead and do it and then find out they can't. Sometimes it's very innocent. It's as simple as a pool. Somebody thought they'd be able to build a pool. They didn't call anyone. Sometimes the vendor doesn't do a great job of checking, and all of a sudden they built a pool that they're actually not legally allowed to build. That being said, decisions of zoning are first made by the building commissioner. If you wish to appeal that decision, it can get appealed to the zoning board of appeals. And from there to court. We talked about the planning board as the 5-member body that generally reviews land use and generally sets out planning functions for the town. They are an elected body. They do focus on planning policy. They are where any town planning projects or planning zoning projects would initiate. They do review all major site plans and subdivision reviews. It used to just be subdivision review, and we had a lot of zoning review of a site plan, but now we've mostly moved site plan to the planning board. That's your elected body that gives a major project additional review. So if you think of a large shopping center, again, we're fully built out in Norwood, so we don't necessarily have these as often. But the Moderna campus is an example. The new hospital campus, whenever it ends up getting built, FM's new building, that's not as simple as just saying, I can build a 400,000 square foot building, I'm going to get a permit and the building commissioner is going to allow me to have it. The planning board is able to review that through generally site plan review and look at where the building is going and have some input on that process and have some regulations as to how they want a larger project to work. That's not every project in town, that's only certain projects, and that's all contained within our zoning code. The planning board also issues special permits for certain projects where you'll notice in our use table, it says special permit required. And that just means, yeah, you can build a restaurant there, but you've got to go through some sort of a special process because we're not just saying you can build one completely by right. The zoning board of appeals, in some ways has nothing to do with zoning, and in some ways has everything to do with zoning. The zoning board of appeals hears appeals to the zoning code because, again, zoning doesn't always work with the reality that we have. However, there's a strict test the zoning board needs to meet. I'm a Rotarian, so I keep thinking of it as the 4-way test, but it's not the 4-way test. But it's not just I want to appeal the zoning code because I want to be able to do something different. There needs to actually be some parameters. The lot needs to be economically unfeasible. It needs to show that there's a hardship. It can't simply be, I want to build a 50,000 square foot pool, so I don't want to follow the zoning. Some people think that's the case, but they can't just hear an appeal because you want there to be an appeal. They also serve as the appeals decisions from appeals decisions board from the zoning enforcement officer. All right, that's our quick overview of land use. That's how it works. Simple, right? We're going to get into the more complicated items by having our planning director go up and go through the 6 articles on the actual warrant. Sarah, I get to sit down, and that's all you.
Enjoy the break.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Tony said, I'm Sarah Dixon. I am privileged to serve as the town's community development director. The other representative elected body that makes major land use decisions is all of you, town meeting members. As Tony said, no changes to our zoning bylaw can be made without the approval of town meeting. And so each change is proposed to you in a series of articles, and that's what we're going through tonight. So let's get to it. The first article here that's being proposed by the planning board to town meeting is an amendment of our zoning bylaw concerning kennels. Right now, our zoning bylaw has an allowance for commercial kennels to operate in not all, but a certain number of our zoning districts, including the single family residential districts. And kind of going back to this zoning 101, right? Our zoning bylaw is really our attempt to balance incompatible uses across various areas of our town. And so the kind of obvious example we use when we talk about that is, maybe like a big manufacturing plant, and then the single family home, right? Kind of incompatible right next to one another. This isn't a case where we're trying to create some distinctions about the use of a commercial kennel and how it might impact its immediate neighbors. And in the single family residential districts, this article changes the allowable use to not unallowable use. It does allow commercial kennels newly. It proposes to allow them in the manufacturing district. It also includes definitions of commercial breeding kennel, commercial training kennel, and personal kennel. Our bylaw has definitions, and then it has the allowable uses. It doesn't have definitions for these things right now. So the bylaw, in an attempt to make it a little bit more inclusive, we're proposing to include new definitions for each of those things. The text for those definitions is directly from state law. There's various agents of the town that have to enforce kennels, the health department, being one of them. So making sure that our zoning is consistent with the state definitions for these uses, we thought was important. So that's kind of the basic overview of that one. There is a provision for personal kennels to be allowable in the single family residential districts by special permit from the Zoning Board of Appeals. And the definition for a personal kennel is more than 3 dogs owned for personal use. And so what that would do, as Tony said, that special permit process, it's not a immediate yes or a hard no. It's just an extra review step. So that somebody who wanted that use in that location would have to go before the zoning board, describe what they're proposing to do, talk about the specifics of their location and how they handle that use. And the board would ask questions to make sure that it's not negatively impacting the neighborhood. Yeah.
Is this retroactive?
It is not. So zoning changes would be going forward. If somebody had a commercial kennel in a single family residential district now, it would be considered pre-existing non-conforming. It would be allowed to continue.
Okay.
Would like a doggy daycare be considered a kennel?
Let me
Some place that puts together dogs during the day.
Yes. So let's look at the definition together. So a commercial,
What do you consider a personal kennel?
it wouldn't be considered a personal kennel, no. So for commercial boarding, the definition is an establishment used for boarding, holding, daycare, overnight stays, or training of animals that are not the property of the owner of the establishment.
So doggy daycare would
Yeah.
be after that.
That would be-
Commercial
Mhm.
kennel.
It can't include like an animal shelter, so that's an exception that's listed out in this definition, but your standard daycare facility would be included.
Just a little clarification on
Sure.
personal kennels.
Mhm.
If I have 4 dogs in my home, they live under the same roof as I do, is that considered a personal kennel?
Yes.
It is. So it doesn't have to be an outdoor structure.
No, it does not.
Thank you.
Are there any limits to the amount of dogs?
So,
understand this is just some rules and regulations
For
for the
the-
animal officer to
Mhm.
control what's going on. Someone have, what's the limit in their home?
For a personal kennel, it would be, 4 or more dogs.
So should we put that on here?
It's in the warrant.
Can I ask what triggered this in the first place?
Yeah, I could actually
Tony
speak to
can take
that. We had a problem where we had a number of neighborhood complaints about a commercial kennel, somebody breeding and selling dogs in a two-family home in a dense neighborhood. And that's currently allowed under zoning. Now, we can't fix that, but a two-family home with maybe 10 feet in between the houses had 8 or 9 dogs that they were breeding and selling dogs and having people coming and picking up the dogs. I mean, it was a dog breeding kennel operation and right in smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood.
That seems like a big stretch between somebody having 4 dogs for a personal house and somebody breeding them and selling them.
It's not though, unfortunately. This is a case of where that's exactly what somebody was doing. You can have your own dogs when you start to sell them. And again, we can,
That's what I'm saying. That's why I don't understand why somebody having 4 dogs that they don't breed and sell, they're just pets, is lumped in with people that are breeding and selling dogs. You follow what I'm saying?
sure.
Two totally different types of
Yeah, so
ownership.
that's true, but we're, in terms of maintaining sort of harmony in the neighborhood, we're not a farm town. Maybe Mr. Costa on his farm could have 4 or 5 dogs. We have to respond to dog complaints, and it's not that just we don't want to respond to them. If it's allowed, there's not much we can do for, whether the dog is a dangerous dog or a nuisance dog. Are they being lumped in? Sure, but that's still a lot of dogs in a small, dense neighborhood. If you never have a problem with your neighbors, it's never going to come to our attention. When it is a problem, and it's been a problem, it becomes an issue.
I would also add to that, the changes we're making do create a distinction in the use table between commercial breeding kennels and personal kennels. So you're correct in the sense that if you just have 4 dogs for your own personal use and you're not breeding and selling them, that is in the same definition as someone who is breeding and selling them.
That's why I'm wondering why they're
But the
lumped together.
distinction between the commercial and the personal is there. And for the personal kennels, it's like not a hard no. It's a special permit review. So you could go before the board and make your case as to why your use doesn't impact your neighbors, why, you know, there's no noise, there's no smell, there's no so on and so forth.
What happens if your dog has a litter?
yeah,
There's actually something in the statute that allows the period while dogs are being born until you,
But it says only adult dogs.
yeah,
It says puppies are counted.
yeah, until they're allowed to grow up. But that's honestly one of the challenges that Gary faces as a zoning enforcement officer is, do I have too many dogs or not? Well, my dogs are just born. They're still puppies. Well, how long is it a puppy for? And then we're trying to verify, is it still a puppy? Really, the goal is to try to be able to restrict the commercial kennels. That's the activity that's going to cause a problem. And if you think about yourself and your neighbor, if you knew that they had 4 dogs, you might just say, oh, the Bumpuses have 4 dogs and they're a little annoying. That's different than people showing up wanting to buy dogs from them and them intentionally breeding dogs and having 8 or 10 dogs live in their house, even if they're fenced in. That's really what we're going with. Zoning is hard to sort of zero in on exactly the one problem you're trying to face. So that's why you try to come up with a solution that works and tries to improve the condition of a neighborhood, really just restricting the commercial use.
Just a little bit more clarification. In Article 1, the table that it refers to, the table of use regulations. The heading, the zoning categories, is different than the existing zoning bylaw. Why was there a change? And it's not referred to in the article.
Which heading are you?
Well, if you look at the table, it says service establishments.
Yeah.
Now the headings for the zoning categories.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the zoning categories in the existing bylaw.
Yeah.
It's a different set of headings.
So
There's a
in-
number of use tables is what that could be.
Yeah, so we have a number of use tables. So
But
previously.
you have one zoning bylaw. Right?
Yes, so previously, the name of this particular use was commercial kennel, animal, or veterinary hospital. We're proposing to break that down to say commercial breeding kennel, commercial training kennel, animal or veterinary hospital, and then inserting a new use below that just for personal kennel. Those are all considered types of service establishments.
But if you look at the existing bylaw, in fact, you had the table up here. Right? after manufacturing, there are two other categories that are gonna eliminate.
The use, yes. So there's what, the use table goes through J, their accessory uses.
Yeah.
There's a
Accessory-
use table for a
accessory
number of
parking.
different
Accessory
categories.
parking is the last one.
Yeah. So F is just the one for service establishments, and that's the only one where commercial kennels falls in.
I know,
That's the
but the
category
existing
for-
bylaw for that particular service establishments, if you look at that table,
Yes.
existing bylaw, the headings are different.
Okay, why don't you grab me at the end and we can go through that change together.
Okay?
And if there's a
Because I
fix
would
that we need to
assume
make,
that-
that we will do that.
If that changed, it would be in the after the change.
Sure. Okay, let's take a look at that at the end. Make sure you grab me. Any other questions on kennels?
Sarah, just a question. Is there a reason why we have the definitions in Article 2 and we have the changes in Article 1? I don't know if there's some reason we did it that way. It seems like we would want to do the definitions in Article 1 if we probably eliminated a lot.
You mean just as an order of operations?
Yeah,
That's
because you're
a
changing,
good
you're
suggestion.
referring to things that we don't change.
That we don't change yet. Yeah, so we could
So
do
that might be
definitions
something
first
the
for town
planning
meeting.
board might want to suggest that we do it.
I think if you didn't adopt Article 1, you automatically wouldn't adopt Article 2. Because of the definition. Wouldn't be relevant. But certainly something to think about.
Yeah,
We're
definitely.
just gonna be going back and forth.
Because otherwise you're adopting, you could adopt
I
definitions
agree with
that are not pertinent if you don't adopt the article.
You're changing the terms, but then you're gonna be going and referring to Article 2.
Yeah, and there's always some discussion about how complicated do you make one article versus breaking it up, and there's no perfect answer. We could change the whole bylaw and everything that we're doing in one article, but then that becomes too complicated. You break it down too small, and then we've got 7 warrant articles.
So to your point, I talked about both of these articles in one swoop. Any other questions on kennels before we move on? Oh,
Just one question. With the example that Tony did, if this passes at town meeting, are those grandfathered in, those existing kennels?
the ones that are accessible,
So the building department can't do anything?
not
Only-
under,
It's a legally pre-existing non-conforming use established prior to the adoption of this article.
I see.
Now, if they stop operating their business, there's a 2-year look back for zoning. So once they've stopped the use for 2 years, that use can't come back. If they wanted to continue to breed dogs in that house year after year after year, they'd be able to do it once they've stopped for 2 years. I can't buy that house and then 5 years later say, well, I'm gonna start breeding dogs because, the previous owner did it 5 years ago.
Does that mean if somebody has 5 dogs, when this passes, they can keep the 5 dogs with no problem?
Correct. Zoning is always going forward. It really can never go back and regulate what's there. That's when we use the term pre-existing non-conforming use, you're allowed to continue to do it. We could zone that McDonald's is no longer allowed to have a restaurant where it is, and they could operate a restaurant for 75 years there, as long as they don't stop what they're doing for 2 years.
Leave fees attached to being a kennel as opposed to privately owned.
so that's not a zoning issue. We're really just talking about the uses. The health department, has their own regs that they enforce. There's dog licenses that the clerk's office maintains. All of that kind of stands apart from this. This is really just an avenue for, the building commissioner to enforce the zoning.
If there is a permit for a personal kennel, they would get a permit from the health department, and then the dog officer would inspect the kennel, whether it's commercial or residential, once a year. Thank you.
All right. The next article is about notice. This is a little bit less interesting than dogs and kennels, admittedly. So the first section of the bylaw establishes a process by which the planning board holds hearings to notify affected parties about changes in the zoning. So the very thing we're talking about now, changes in zoning. Planning board is obligated by state law to hold a public hearing where it invites, members of the public to come, hear a presentation about the article, ask questions, and make their comments known to the board. The board uses that hearing to formulate its report that it provides to town meeting with a recommendation. Currently, our bylaw does have a section that establishes some local rules on how we provide notice to interested parties. But if I can be candid with you, that language is very squishy. it doesn't really identify or define who's an affected party, right? And how are you notifying them? It gives a lot of latitude and discretion to the planning board to figure out who's important enough to be mailed a notice of a public hearing. You could see why that might be kind of problematic, right? It also sets this bar that says, you know, if there's over 50 affected parties, that's too many and you don't have to provide notice to anyone. So although the planning board has always provided the amount of notice that is required by state law, we have heard responses from, you know, all of you consistently over the last few years that they feel like they've missed out on the boat and they haven't found out about these public hearings, and they're crucially important, right? It's a really good opportunity for people to be able to come to the board and talk to them about how they feel about these articles before you even get to this stage in the process. So that's where this article came from. It takes those regulations and kind of firms them up a little bit so that there's some very clear guidance for me and my department, really, to provide those legal notices of these changes. What it says is that anybody who's in the district that's affected, so if we're rezoning a particular piece of land, owners of property located in that district and adjacent parcels receive a mailed notice with the legal ad. It additionally proposes that any town meeting members who represent that district where that land is located, who have provided their email addresses to the certified list in the clerk's office, they'll receive an emailed legal notice of the public hearing as well. So, and it lifts the cap from 50 to 200. So we've kind of determined 200 is a reasonable amount. It's not an exorbitant cost for us to send out, you know, a mailing of 1,000, 2,000 would be unmanageable, but 200 is something that's a gentle lift to be able to give more notice in a meaningful way without kind of taxing our capacity in the office. We tested this out, just FYI. You may have gotten an email from my department earlier in the season in advance of the public hearing on these in early February. We kind of tested this out, even though it's not in practice yet. We wanted to make sure that we were following our own proposed rules. So the only one here that triggered that advance notice was the MBTA communities articles. So we did send out mailed notices to property owners in the proposed affected districts there. Any questions on this one?
That 200 max, does that include the email one?
It doesn't. Just the mail. So something like the Boston Providence Highway District that we did a couple of years ago, it rezoned, you know, 4 miles on each side of Route 1. You know, all of those property owners and their adjacent property owners would have been way over 200, and that would have still been a challenge for us to be able to mail that notice. But for something like MBTA communities, it was right around 200, so we were able to handle that okay. Okay. Very good. All right.
Question on the timing.
Yep, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah.
So I see you have 14 days, you know, to get to the planning board. You've got 65 days for the board. But what's the timing for the notices to be sent? Because either I'm missing it or I'm just not seeing it.
Sure. So that's something that's prescriptive in the Zoning Act and MGL Chapter 40A. The first, we back it up. So we have to publish, this is our legal requirement, right? We have to publish in a newspaper of local circulation. The first publication has to be 14 days, at least 14 days prior to the public hearing. So we typically mail out those notices the week of that publication. So it's at least 2 weeks beforehand. My personal rule is I don't like people to find out about public hearings for their properties or their neighbors' properties by picking up the paper. I'd rather, if it's their neighbor, they get those. So that's what I like to follow in my office. But it's usually around that same week. Norwood Record publishes on Thursdays, so we try to get those notices out on Monday or Tuesday.
So just to be clear, it's more than 200. You don't do a mailing, but you still do the emails and telling.
We'll always do the emails to town meeting members. That costs us nothing. And this requires us to get it certified by the town clerk. So I guess PSA, if anybody here doesn't have their email address provided to the town clerk, make sure you do that. It's a great way to be able to get sometimes just a little bit more information.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. All right, this is when things get spicy. MBTA Communities Multifamily Overlay District. Many of you kind of looking through have been to more than one of our events on MBTA communities. So at this point, I think a lot of you can probably give this presentation. I'll keep it a little bit shorter than I normally do. While still giving you the basics, and then we'll have questions on both this and the map at the end, if that's okay with everyone. All right, so what is the new Section 3A law? 3A is an amendment to the state's zoning act that was passed by the state legislature a couple of years ago. It requires communities like ours that have either public transit, commuter rail, or subway, right? Or are next to those communities to create a zoning district where multifamily housing is allowed as a matter of right, not by special permit, but as a matter of right. There's 177 communities. If you look at the map, it's more or less all of Eastern Massachusetts. We have a couple of standards that we have to follow. This zoning district has to meet some standards on density and size. So it has to be, for us, 50 acres. 90% of that in Norwood needs to be located within a half mile of our commuter rail stations, any of the three that we have, Norwood Central, Norwood Depot, or Windsor Gardens. It has to have a minimum density of 15 units per acre. And we can talk more about density in a minute and what that means. It had to be suitable for families with children. We couldn't set any age restrictions. So we couldn't say this is a zone only for 55 and over housing. We couldn't say this is a zone where only studio apartments can be constructed. It has to be suitable for families with children. And just like a brief word on this, this was the state's attempt to respond to the housing crisis that's affecting, pretty much all of the state, but particularly Eastern Massachusetts. Our housing production numbers are among the lowest in the nation, and a severe shortage of housing supply has resulted in skyrocketing prices. Pretty much everybody's experienced that in some way or another, whether it's home sale prices or rents. And so this was their effort to try to encourage communities, most of which have made multifamily housing more or less illegal. Many of these communities don't have either any multifamily housing on the ground or have any legal avenue in their zoning to construct it at all. That's not true for Norwood. It's not been true for Norwood for a long time, but a lot of those communities don't allow it at all. And added together, it kind of created this regional crisis and therefore the regional response. So we are, like all of those other communities, required to come into compliance with this new law. The task force, MBTA task force, was a group that was assembled by the planning board to research this, to conduct public engagement, and to come up with a recommendation to the planning board on how we can create our new zoning district and come into compliance with this law. Our deadline is the end of this year to come into full compliance. This is a brief overview of the process that we've taken to get to this point. We've been working for over 18 months now on this. We submitted an action plan to the state that achieved our interim compliance. That was basically just a fill in the blanks. We're going to work on this. We promise. This is what we're going to do. Here's our phone number, and this is how you can email Sarah if you need something. So we submitted that in January of 2023, and then the task force moved into the real. The primary emphasis of its work was public engagement. That was really the beginning of all of this. It's really what the task force wanted to drive the proposal that comes before you now. So it started with public education events, really trying to educate people on what this law was, what it wasn't, what folks could expect of the process going forward. And then we moved into community discussion. And that was a lot of events that were less about, me up here talking to you, although we've gotten back to that point, and more about you guys talking to us and letting us know what you think of the law, what you think of the town's housing needs, and how you'd like to see this developed to meet those needs. So we held a series of small group discussions over the summer. I think a lot of you were at least one of them. We divided into small groups and led those groups through a series of discussion prompts where people talked about what they love best about Norwood, what they want to preserve in Norwood, and areas where they think Norwood could grow. People also shared a lot of their own personal experiences with housing, whether it was housing shortage, supply, prices, things affecting their family members, accessibility challenges, and more. So that was throughout last summer. The task force then kind of synthesized all of that, tried to come up with some themes. There was a survey that was open for a few months also. We had over 100 respondents to that. We had over 70 people come to our small group discussions. So participation, I was really impressed. It was really a great opportunity to hear from so many people in town, many of whom I hadn't met. So it was a cool opportunity. The task force kind of brought all that together, tried to figure out how to make that work into a bylaw that kind of was responsive to those needs and still met all the requirements for the state. Made that recommendation to planning board, which continued to work on that document and kind of refine it. And that brings us to here. Planning board conducted its public hearing a couple of weeks ago and is recommending it to town meeting 5-0. So now we go to town meeting with this. This is just a little kind of overview of those community engagement events. Like I said, they were really, really great sessions. We were able to really hear from a lot of folks about what was important in town and a lot of their concerns. Obviously people are concerned about this zoning. Multifamily housing zoning is always something that incites a lot of passion and questions. And so it was a really great opportunity to kind of work through that together. Ultimately, the product that is before you now for approval is, I think, strategic in that it meets the requirements of the state law and also takes it as an opportunity to try to address some of the concerns that we know exist, both because that's what the data tells us, that's what the numbers tell us, but also because that's what you all expressed in our community engagement process. So just on the mechanics of it, where are they? The district is broken into 3 sub-districts, 1 at each of our train stations. Just kind of briefly, the Norwood Depot one includes the crossings at Railroad and Central, and then it jumps over and continues down the track side of Lenox Street from the townhomes, the DPW property, Norwood Tires 2 properties, and the Rockland Trust building. So that's the Norwood Depot sub-district. The Windsor Gardens sub-district is just the land that Windsor Gardens operates.
Can I just confirm on the Norwood Depot, it's the red crosshatching?
It's the red crosshatching, yeah. Okay. Sorry, that's super confusing.
So many
I know,
all of these.
the blue horizontal crossing is the Central Business District.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, more of a downtown location. Windsor Gardens is just Windsor Gardens. I mean, that's the underlying zoning there is our existing multifamily zoning district. So that's fairly straightforward. Norwood Central contains the land on Lenox Street on the train tracks side from the bottom of Subway Hill at the train bridge crossing all the way up to Avalon. It includes Avalon, and that's where the district stops. That's the green crosshatching right here. It also includes 2 parcels on the other side of the tracks. One is a vacant lot owned by Stewart, and the other one is a vacant lot where Auto Doctor is located. That lot actually, you can sort of see it on the map. It's long. Both of those lots stretch all the way back towards the Verona Plaza. So those 2 lots are on the other side of the tracks. So that's the Norwood Central subdistrict. Like I said, the site selection here was strategic. We wanted to be able to, again, meet the requirements that the state set forward, while also taking advantage of an opportunity to encourage some redevelopment in areas that needed it. The strategy here was to zone areas that either already have multifamily housing on them, which is a significant portion of what you see here. Windsor Gardens has over 900 units. There's over 100 at the crossings. There's over 200 for Print Lofts and Avalon combined. So either existing multifamily housing sites or previously zoned manufacturing. It used to be that that's where you put your manufacturing properties, was right on the train tracks, right? Some of the properties on Lenox Street still have the train, the garage bays that back right up to the train tracks, even though they don't use them anymore. That was just how you developed land. And now people want to live near those train tracks so that they can commute in more sustainable ways and affordable ways. So that was the strategy here. There's a handful of vacant parcels, no more than, I would say, 5 or 6 acres total, that are vacant, underdeveloped, or underutilized lots that aren't really doing a whole lot for the town. Those were intentionally included to try and stimulate some reinvestment into those properties. Including the multifamily housing into this district does a couple of things as well. It kind of mitigates the potential impact that this would have if we were to impose our zoning over 80 acres of farmland. Not that we have 80 acres of farmland or woods, but if we did, we would expect to see many of those acres, if not all 80, redeveloped, right? The market would support a need for redevelopment to occur on all 80 of those acres. Here, that's not really going to be the case, right? There's already multifamily housing, much of it pre-existing non-conforming at a density that exceeds what would be allowed under this new bylaw. So there's not as much economic incentive for redevelopment of those parcels. What this does is create a district where there's compatibility with these proposed uses and what's already there. I won't read this word for word. You all have the warrant, but just kind of generally, going back to this idea, the approach here was to really try to take this. Nobody likes a state mandate. I've heard that for the last 18 months. I get it. But to the extent that we have to come into compliance with this state law, why don't we take this and make it work for us? And so that's really what the driver here was. We heard a lot of kind of consensus points. Everybody has a different view on what they'd like to see happen with Norwood and how they'd like to see this zoning kind of shake out. But the themes here, housing supply was a concern. Lots of people have had personal experiences with not being able to, size up for a growing family or size down for empty nesters or find more accessible housing or find rental housing. Affordability was a big theme. Everybody, kind of responded and said, yeah, this is crazy. The market's just nuts right now. Traffic, people are concerned about the impacts that potential redevelopment could have on increasing our traffic situation. Our roads are pretty busy, especially certain times of day. And so, the bylaw does attempt to address each of these things. So, on supply, this was not an article that just did the least and tried to encourage no redevelopment whatsoever, right? This is us taking an opportunity to try to encourage reinvestment on a handful of sites, not all of them, but a handful that need it. Affordability, the state doesn't require us to deed restrict any of the resulting housing that gets constructed as a result as affordable. But we heard very strongly that there is a need for more affordable units and deeper affordability at that. We heard from a lot of folks, have you heard how much the affordable rents are at Avalon or Upland Woods? It's $2,800. That's not affordable. That's not wrong, right? It is really out of reach for a lot of people. And so the bylaw that's before you proposes to require 10% of redevelopment for projects that have between 8 and 15 units. 10% of those units would need to be set aside as affordable. For projects that are 16 or more units, a full 20% would need to be set aside as affordable to income qualified households. And then, traffic. We didn't have to, but we chose to locate this district all within a half mile of the train stations. Much of it is actually much closer than that, to really try to encourage development of housing that would attract less car-dependent residents. And another way we can do that is by adjusting the required parking minimums. We talked a lot about how zoning regulates uses and dimensional requirements, but our zoning also is where we put in requirements for things like open space and landscaping of commercial properties or our parking requirements. The more parking we require, the less space we have available for green space and for units of housing. So, because we're concerned about traffic, we really kind of adjusted down our expectations about how many parking spaces will be required to be constructed. That's one way we can address that concern. Accessibility was a theme that we heard a lot about. The housing stock in Norwood is old. You all know this, right? We have a lot of older homes. My house is a 1928 3-bedroom cape, and the only bathroom is upstairs. There's also a weird toilet in the basement. I feel like a lot of people have those. And that's pretty common. So what we heard a lot was, well, I'm fine where I'm at now, but if I were to break a hip or have some sort of a mobility challenge, I don't know where I'd go, right? There's just not a lot of options here in Norwood. And so the response here, was to think about ways that we could encourage development that was more accessible. Some communities in the state have kind of tackled this law and come up with a response that really only focuses on the single family neighborhoods and says, we're not going to allow any 3 or 4 story buildings anywhere in town. We're just going to spread it out over the whole town to achieve this density that we're required to come into compliance with, and allow single family homeowners to turn their homes into 2 families, right? And that's a legitimate way of coming at this problem. What we heard is we really value the character of our single family neighborhoods, and we need more accessible housing. And Gary can tell you a lot better than I can, but when you have a 3 or 4 story building, code requirements are triggered for things like elevators and a certain percentage of the units being fully accessible to people with disabilities. And so by kind of concentrating our proposed zone in a smaller area with a little bit of building height, we can encourage development that actually meets that need. And scale to neighborhood, again, that's another reason why we went in that direction of encouraging, more mid-rise development in smaller areas. And finally, these last two were also a theme for priorities that we heard from people is open space. Norwood is almost fully developed. The precious green spaces that we still have, we really want to make sure we value those and preserve those, and when possible, try to increase them. So what you'll see in the bylaw is requirements for open space that exceed what's required presently. We've also been, again, strategic about placing the district in areas that many of them, especially the manufacturing areas where you would probably see some redevelopment occur in the next 5 years. A lot of those are paved out to the corners of the lot. There's no green space, there's no open space, there's no stormwater management, there's no solution for drainage and floodwater. And so the requirements in the bylaw move in a direction where you'd actually see more green space and more of those solutions to help prevent flooding events that we've seen in the last few years. And sustainability. So the proposed bylaw incorporates some sustainable growth principles, and it also provides some building incentives for developments that kind of go above and beyond on sustainable development standards.
Is there anything in there about the garages? So if you have a 15 unit thing go up, what would people do? Could you put a garage underneath rather than, is that allowed?
Yes, so structured parking or underground parking is not only permitted, but it's incentivized. So if you are a developer and you elect to put your parking underground, whatever surface area would have been taken up by your 100, whatever spaces in your parking lot, if you return that to green space and locate your parking underground, then you're eligible to receive an extra floor of building height. It's an expensive thing to put your parking underground, right? So these incentive categories are designed to incentivize development that meets a public good in exchange for, a financial incentive that makes it worthwhile for a developer. That's a lever that's used fairly often in zoning to try to encourage development that goes above and beyond standards. So that's included in there.
Okay, what would happen if, like, I think it was down near the Savern, didn't they want to put building above and then have a parking space on the level
Yeah, podium parking,
Okay.
same thing. So if they returned that surface area to green open space, they would be eligible for an extra floor building.
Thank you.
Yeah, in your informational meetings, I have a feeling there's a certain sentiment of residents that this rezoning is kind of going a little bit overboard in the sense that you're really promoting more development than the state requires. My understanding is that there's a minimum of 50 acres. However, this rezoning dedicates 56% more than that, like 72 or 3 acres.
78.
78.
78, is that right? In light of that, I don't know if you've gotten that feedback.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So you said, oh, yeah. So it's a big portion of the sentiment
Yeah.
of some homeowners that we've gone too far on this.
Yeah.
And I'd just like you to speak to that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you bring that up because it is one of the top questions we've been getting, and it's important. So what I would say is that I think I'm not disputing that, right? This proposed district is 78 acres, would be required to do a minimum of 50. The density that we're proposing is way more than 15 units an acre. 15 units an acre is honestly, some of our single family residential neighborhoods qualify around 15 units an acre because we have small lot sizes, right? We're not a town with,
I think
1
Avalon-
acre McMansion zoning.
I think Avalon's around 18.
We do exceed. However, I would argue that, well, actually, going back to kind of compliance, there's a third measure of compliance that we also have to contend with, and that's a unit capacity number. So unit capacity is a concept, right, where it's a measurement tool. So you take the amount of land that you're going to rezone, and again, this is hypothetical. You wipe everything off of it, everything that's there, the banks, the homes, the parks, everything. If everything were to get raised and redeveloped as multifamily housing, the only use would be multifamily housing. If everything was built to the maximum capacity, as tall and as wide and all of that, how many units could you place on that land? It's hypothetical because that's not real life, right? Like that's not what's going to happen. But it is a measurement tool to kind of test about how your dimensional requirements interact with one another. It's possible to zone 50 acres at 15 units an acre, but require 400-foot setbacks and, require 10 units of parking per unit. And functionally, you wouldn't be able to build anything. So that's what the unit capacity tries to achieve. So we had a unit capacity figure of 2,047. You might have read about that in the paper or seen it on Facebook. 2,000 additional units of housing getting constructed in Norwood. That is, misleading because the unit capacity figure is never going to be expected to be the actual redevelopment figure. It's hypothetical, but it means that we had to take this unit capacity and kind of stretch it over a piece of land to fit. So we could have achieved 2,000 units on unit capacity in 10 acres, or 50 acres in taller buildings with no open space. Or you could stretch it out over a larger piece with lower density and some of the things that we've established as priorities like open space, lowered parking, setbacks that respect neighbors, especially in the Norwood Central District where there's single family homeowners that are across the street. It had to be bigger than 50 acres in order to achieve that kind of modest expectations that would fit our neighborhoods.
So if I can play this back.
Yeah.
So if you decided to restrict yourself to 50 acres, the feeling was what would be put on those 50 acres would not be acceptable. It might be too tall and you get all complaints.
It just
because
wouldn't
of the
be
way-
consistent with
the
what
way
we're
it was
looking for.
developed.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you have to kind of, it's an equation.
No, I get it.
It's not a check. It's an equation. And you kind of have to mold it to fit what your priorities are. If we didn't want any open space, if that wasn't a priority to us, then we probably could have made our district a lot smaller. But open space is a priority. So again,
Because
making it
you
a
hear
little bit
this
bigger.
on the other side saying, hey, look at all the apartments and all of this. And then you say, well, I'm using 78 acres instead of 50.
Right.
Yeah, it's alarming. to some
Yeah,
people.
absolutely. I would also tell you, the unit capacity, when you measure our district, is larger than 2,047 units. However, it's important to not focus just on the paper compliance and also look at what the actual impact of, like, this is all about rules. This is rules. This is not actual development. This doesn't require anything to actually be built. You have to think about what the impact of these rules actually means on the land that you're rezoning. And I keep using the word strategic to describe how we selected the sites, but it very much was strategic to be able to control the terms of our development, right? All of these rules that we're setting to be appropriate on the areas that we would like to see some redevelopment. But we also intentionally included a lot of other areas so that we wouldn't see kind of that full realization of that unit capacity. It's really trying to take this and take control over it and direct it in the ways that meet the needs, but don't do a whole lot more.
Is it possible to separate the Windsor Garden property from the other two districts that you created? Because, and maybe you haven't got to it yet, because of the multi-use aspect that you've also baked into the zoning, right? You haven't talked about that yet.
Yeah, so I
It
can certainly
changes-
touch on that.
It changes a lot in terms of what that land can be used for, especially at Windsor Gardens.
Yeah, so each of these three sub-districts has a different set of requirements. That's an important thing to note that I didn't mention before. You may have already noticed it reading through the text. The dimensional requirements are a little bit different. These are three kind of distinctly different neighborhoods. And so the things like the setbacks are going to be different to respect what's already there. Windsor Gardens, stands alone. It has a higher parking requirement. It's less walkable. It's further away from town. It does represent the vast majority of the acreage in the district. It's over 40 acres out there by itself. It's also very densely developed already. There's almost 1,000 units at Windsor Gardens alone. And so you could, in theory, come into compliance with this bylaw by forgetting about the downtown and just kind of looking at Windsor Gardens. But that would be a missed opportunity to encourage some reinvestment in these areas closest to the two train stations that are used the most. And again, listening to all of our public feedback sessions, what we heard was not a call for nothing. We heard a call to try to encourage some reinvestment in areas that meet the needs of people who live and work here. You couldn't take out Windsor Gardens because then you wouldn't have enough acreage in the other two to meet your state requirements. So together, that's how you end up with a proposal that kind of hits all those boxes for us.
That's not what I'm getting at.
Mixed use.
The
I don't want to forget that. Yeah. So mixed use is when you have commercial and residential use on the same lot. So all of our properties down Washington Street in our uptown area are mixed use. You have residential above and first floor, retail, restaurant, whatever. Mixed use is not required in these three districts, but it is allowed, which is already true for Norwood Depot. That's already true for the underlying zoning, so that's not a change. Norwood Central would allow mixed use if there was a market for it, and Windsor Gardens would also allow for some mixed use. One of the feedback points that we heard a lot of was accessibility and sustainability. A consensus point that we heard from, and this again supports sustainable growth principles and smart development practices, complete neighborhoods, vibrant neighborhoods, neighborhoods that have all the things that you need, kind of within arm's reach. We heard a lot of folks, we had one session that was co-hosted by the Commission on Disability, and we heard from a lot of people that their quality of life was good because they could get themselves to the grocery store. If they couldn't drive, they could walk to the grocery store and get the things that they needed, or to town hall or to the library. Mixed use, if there's a market for it, and the market will decide, the developer will decide if it's appropriate for a particular spot, it does encourage over the long term neighborhoods that have more of that kind of vibrancy, the goods, jobs, services closer to where people live. And that's the kind of positive point of it, but it's limited to ground level, and it's not all uses.
My pushback here is Windsor Garden is much different than the parcel at Norwood Central or the parcel at the depot. It's mainly, a resident area. What this new zoning, law, will allow in the Windsor Garden areas, according to what I've read, I might be wrong, you could allow restaurants, a daycare, private school, retail sales, printing business, cabinet making.
No, you're
You couldn't
reading it
allow
correctly.
any of that where it's not allowed today.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, I like the plan, but I'd like to see the Windsor Gardens area separated from the other two and just create another column in our tables for Windsor Gardens. Because I don't think that's acceptable, what you're gonna allow in the Windsor Gardens area.
Appreciate your point of view. Thank you.
You talked about encouraging accessible units.
Mhm.
How are you gonna do that? Much more expensive, I can tell you.
Mhm.
So that's a lot of people are complaining about that. So what are you gonna do to encourage that?
Can you
The
speak a
builders.
little bit more to kind of code requirements that are triggered at like the
It's-
mid-level range of construction versus
Yeah, I don't
single
have,
family homes?
the table in front of me, so I don't want to give misinformation. I mean, I can certainly respond to it. If you want to email me, I'll dig it up but I mean, most of the developers will certainly provide, either units that are already accessible, like move-in ready,
Yeah.
but also convertible. If the building in and of itself is fully accessible, which over 2 stories will be, they usually will have the ability to convert units to be fully accessible if needed. Or, they'll build them right out of the box accessible. And new construction to make them fully accessible is really not that much more expensive. Retrofitting definitely is.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. I built an accessible house. I can tell you, it's much more expensive to get. And you need it. Builders need to have a perk in order to do that. So that, there needs to be something in
Understood.
there. And as far as this gentleman saying that you can build, daycares and you can build, commercial units. I live in the next street over. I sure as heck don't want any of that in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is a residential neighborhood. And that's gonna overflow into my neighborhood.
And
I don't want that.
The traffic.
This is an overlay district.
It is.
And can you just explain in general, how do overlay district works and how do overlapping overlay districts work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these are overlays. They kind of exist in addition to the underlying zoning. You can use, I don't know, Norwood Depot as an example. The underlying zoning in Norwood Depot is Central Business District that allows for some multifamily housing, but not at the density that this would allow. So the 2 zoning districts can exist simultaneously. All of the uses that are permitted in the underlying district continue to be allowed. So Norwood Central is manufacturing. It will continue to be manufacturing. If somebody wants to use that land for manufacturing, if they want to open a new plant or factory there, they can. This just adds another option. And if you want to develop multifamily housing, then the overlay is triggered and you have to be in meet all of those requirements in the overlay. But the underlying doesn't go away and that can continue if the market requires it.
So if you propose a development where you've got base district and say 2 different overlay districts,
Mhm.
the developer would have to decide which district they're building under, right? Can't mix and match the requirements.
More or less, yeah.
Say, I'm going to do a manufacturing development, so therefore the manufacturing rule will apply.
Ernie, did you want to?
Just on that point, no one is under any obligation to build apartments here. There's no mandate to build apartments. You can, as Sarah said, that the underlying district is manufacturing. If you want to put up a manufacturing plant, you still have that ability. All this does is give another tool in the toolbox, another option that a developer or a landowner could have with his land. Just going back, I want to go back to the very beginning and just make one statement. And Sarah did a phenomenal job explaining this. But the state, it's a state mandate came down and it was thrust upon the town. And what the task force did was take this as an opportunity to create something that we feel would work for Norwood. Yes, we could have done the bare minimum. Yes, we could have done, just written it as close to the bare minimum as possible to get the state approval and be done with it. But nothing would happen. And so we use this as an opportunity to create something that would work for Norwood. Something that personally I think was long overdue. I mean, I think at one of the last town meetings we had discussion about a developer that wanted to take a single parcel, and the talk was, let's look at the whole area. And I think we've done that. The expansion to 78 acres, what we've added, and the task force really went over this. We looked at these things. These are areas that are underutilized. They're either parking lots, the talk that, well, we're too many apartments, it's going to look like a city. That's fine. People have that opinion. That they're absolutely totally can have that opinion that we have too many apartments or we're overbuilt. And we're going to lose the town, the town effect. But driving by these, I look at a couple of these parking lots that have been empty. I've lived here my whole life. They've been empty for 60 years since the lumber company and Beaver Coal moved out 60 years ago, and they've been empty parking lots. If that's what you like, then that's fine. But I think the redevelopment, this new growth, this ability, I think the bylaw is each district has its own set of rules as far as heights, setbacks, things like that, tailored to that neighborhood. I think it works, but going back to your thing, under no obligation is any developer or a landowner, I should say, they are not, if they want to do something with their land, they do not have to put up apartments. That is absolutely, they do not have to do it. They can do whatever is allowed in the other underlying districts.
How many households do we anticipate?
It's a good question. So I've run some preliminary figures, and just narrowing on those vacant lots that are kind of ripe for redevelopment. We know that there's probably interest in redeveloping them. It's about 3 sites, 6 acres total, and under the dimensional requirements that are proposed here, the most you'd see is about 300 total units in the next 5 years.
4 families.
Yeah, it would be up to the developer. So we can't regulate that it has to be studios or 1 bedrooms, but typically what we see right now in the market is that the developer will come in and it'll be a mix, a few 3 bedrooms, a few 2 bedrooms, but mostly 1 bedrooms.
I mean, if we're talking all 78 acres, I mean, what are we talking about? We must, if the town opens up the doors for this. I mean, there was the property on Lennox Street, I believe, a couple town meetings ago that.
So that's one of the properties.
Right.
Yeah. That's one of those 6 acres.
Yeah, what is the town bracing for when it comes to like realistic numbers that people are going to try to develop?
I think 300 total units is a realistic expectation of, what you might see in the next 5 years. Zoning takes, this is us planning for the long term, so I can be realistic with you and say, yeah, this isn't going to be nothing. We're going to see some redevelopment and probably in the next few years, and it's probably going to be, no more than a few hundred units. Over time, as properties turn over, businesses close, maybe structures become obsolete and run down, they reach the end of their useful life. You've got a property owner who says, I think I want to get out of town, or I want to sell this. What are my options? Yeah, you may see some gradual change over time. But when you actually zero down and you look at the parcels we've selected here, a lot of those parcels are very unlikely to turn over to be redeveloped under this law, or even again, and this is why including those multifamily housing parcels is really important. Avalon exists at a residential density that far exceeds what's allowed here. Nobody, even in 20 years, is going to knock Avalon down and rebuild under this bylaw because there's no motivation to do that. So, and that's why I say, focus less on the number of acres and more on the practical impact of what we're actually dealing with here in Norwood. You're really not going to see anywhere near that, that 2047 figure. nothing.
What is the threshold before services have to be increased? You know, is there a town-wide per capita basis that says, you know, for every household, we need X amount of police service, we need X amount of fire service, we need X amount of classrooms, we need X amount of teachers? Where do we, what triggers the next, I'm waiting.
Sure, yeah, I can address that. So there's no formal or set statistic or standard, and it depends on what the needs are in the community at the time. One of the things that's important to know, we have about 31,000 residents in town. 50 years ago, we had 31,000 residents in town. Our population projections from the 60s predicted we'd be somewhere in the mid-50s. So our population hasn't actually changed for all intents and purposes in the last 50 years. Went down for a little while, went up a little bit. We have a bigger commercial base that sometimes could lead to increased fire needs to be able to address that. But we're an old mill town. We like to forget that we are, but we've been set up for the industrial type of town we are for quite a while. Is 500 more units going to lead to more cops or firefighters? It depends. The answer is maybe. We have 31,000 people with 3,500 kids in our school district. Franklin has 33,000 people, many more single family homes than we have, much fewer apartment rentals than we have. They have 5,000 students in their school district. So I don't want to scare anyone, but our current infrastructure could probably fit enough families that another 1,000 children could join the school district if we don't build another unit in town. I hope that doesn't happen. We don't have that kind of room. No, you're right. We couldn't handle it. But the point is, you have a neighborhood with 20 homes in it that are 20 families with young kids or 20 senior citizens. We have a lot of seniors staying in their home. That neighborhood could turn over and put 30 kids into a school department, just like people buying the houses and younger families moving in. If you could predict this, you'd be able to do it. We'd all make millions of dollars. Are 500 or 600 units going to lead to more police and more fire? It depends on how you have to look at it. We have 5,500 rental units now. I mean, that's a big number, big compared to other towns our size that have that many rental units. Windsor Gardens has 900 units in it. The short answer is it depends, but is 300 units going to lead to a fundamental changing in staffing? Not with Public Works. Public safety, we have
transients on, probably got 50,000 people, and it's people coming in and out.
Yeah, our daytime
More congestion.
population is different. Our daytime population actually hovers around 70,000 sometimes. That's the number of people that are in here working and shopping and doing business during the day. So would another 1,000 census residents do a big deal? It's hard to say. 6 years ago, we had 29,000 people. We're up to 31,000. We haven't had any cops or firefighters.
I mean, I look at the 300 number, right? And it just doesn't seem like that's realistic. Like, I think we're in for a bigger influx of people. I mean, and I'll go back to like the mixed use overlay district or whatever we did downtown, right? Where nothing has happened because there's just not enough meat on the bone for these people. So when somebody's going to go in and wipe something out, they're going to build it, and they're going to want to build it, and they're going to want to build it as big as possible and put as many townhomes or low-rise homes or anything they can on any scratch of land that they can find. So I'm really curious to know, like, it can't be 300. If it says 2,000, I mean, I understand that was like a model to actually see like what you can bid.
It's not, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's not a hypothetical figure, right?
Right.
So the things that we have to provide to the state for compliance is this super complicated spreadsheet, right? It actually enters in parcel by parcel, every lot that we've chosen, and it's a model. It takes the front setback, it takes the building height, it takes the side setbacks, it takes how much parking we're requiring, it takes how much open space we're requiring, and it's a calculator, and it says, okay, given all of this on this piece of land, this one and this one and this and this one, this is how many units could be built with what we're proposing. And we have control over that. We have control to say the building can't be more than 3 or 4 stories tall. It has to be 40 feet away from the front setback. It has to have 1 parking space per unit. It has to have 20% of the lot reserved as open. Like, we get to set those rules. So, you know, I agree with you in theory. Yes, that is what the market would do if we didn't set local controls, but that's what we're doing. And that 300 number is a direct result of the calculator produced by what's proposed here. Does that make sense?
What do we lose if we don't do this?
If we do nothing, you say just nothing at all. You say
Just leave things the way they are.
So-
So what grants are we not gonna?
A lawsuit from the state.
Yeah, it's more of a lawsuit than I'm worried about than the grant funding. If it's just the grant funding, it'd be easy to say the heck with it. The Attorney General is suing the town of Milton, and looking to advance it directly to the the SJC. That alone is gonna cost quite a bit of money, and ultimately what's gonna happen, the state maybe takes a few years, they'll ultimately win. The legislature under the law can control our zoning, they can control all of our bylaws. They could take the same ordinance that we don't like and simply say, you're allowed to do it. They could remove 40B restrictions and you could remove any building restrictions. It really depends on how far the SJC goes and what they allow the Attorney General to be able to do. I don't care about the grants. I care about the Attorney General getting an order from the SJC, which we can do nothing about, saying that they can appoint somebody to dictate the town zoning. You'd hope you get a rational person that would say, well, this is a good plan or close to this and let's do it. But what if we don't? I mean, the state is really whacking the town of Milton hard. In the history of the Commonwealth, the state hasn't this quickly come out and had the Attorney General sue a town directly. It's a little, the poor building commissioner in Milton's getting sued. Who the guy had nothing to do with it. He's the person named in the lawsuit. So we don't want Gary to get sued. I'd be more concerned that we're going to lose.
They're gonna get me disappointed if they still
I'm okay with urban sprawl. If people have to go live somewhere else, like, that's, I can wrap my head around.
Do I agree with 3A? No, I don't agree with any of the laws the state makes us do anything. I don't agree with the way they do 3A. I don't agree with the way they do state fund, school funding. I don't agree with the way they do road funding. I don't agree with the zoning law that we have to make rules that they have to approve. I don't agree with anything the state tells us to do. I just think that if there was a better option to fight it and not comply, people might want to do it. We're going to lose. We're going to get a lawsuit, and what we could get could end up being so much worse. We do have a little bit of a history in Norwood, last 10 or 15 years with zoning, 20 years, of occasionally saying no to things and getting something that's a lot worse than what we've said no to. I have to speculate that would be the case. Henry, you're dying to ask me a question.
Yes,
Go
I
for
am.
it.
Well, one thing is, you know, this.
Here.
We'll get to Ed next, I promise.
It had nothing to So, you know, the state, as far as, I think the city's made a big mistake when they let this come in the first place without challenging it. Never understood why the towns all didn't get together, 170 towns, and say to your reps, we're not in favor of this, do something. But everybody sat back and waited for this to happen.
That we don't get into, this is not town meeting.
Right.
This is a question and answer session.
But his question about why it wasn't, I appreciate that.
No, this is part of the reason why we're here.
No, we're here to
But the
ask
question as to why the
questions.
town didn't fight it, we fought Prop 2.5. We fought ed reform. We fought this, everything we fight. I don't want to say the legislature doesn't care. They're looking at the state and what's in the best interest of the state. If we could simply all band together and tell our reps, I can tell you every day of every year, letters go from every city and town to their reps about every damn issue under the sun, and it doesn't matter. We've advocated for more school funding. We've not gotten a dime for more school funding. We've advocated for more road funding. It doesn't happen. The Mass Municipal Association has their list every year of all the things they want. And the Police Chiefs Association does, and the Fire Chiefs Association does, and the fire unions and the teachers unions. Everyone is always asking the state to say, let's band together and do our thing. I don't want to say that they don't listen, but they're trying to balance all that together. If we could do that, we would get them to just raise the income tax and not have property taxes, or get them to fully fund schools and it wouldn't be a problem. Give us the money to deal with this and we wouldn't worry about growth because we could just provide the services. It's not that we're not trying to, the state's going to pass the laws, the state's going to pass. I don't think they're ignoring cities and towns. They're trying to solve the problem at their level and it's delegated down to us to deal with it. The same with every law that doesn't work for us that the state's passed for 50 years or more.
In the interest of time, if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to take one more question from the room on this and go online and take a couple more questions and then move on because we do have one more article and I want to make sure in the interest of time we talk about that and give an opportunity for questions. We can come back to this and ask more questions if there are still some, but I just want to make sure we cover all of the articles.
So one of the reasons that there is a housing shortage region is that we've added a lot of jobs, but not a lot of housing. And so I was just curious, how many jobs have we been adding in Norwood? Like how fast is our job growth outstripping our housing growth?
That's a good question. And I don't have an answer for you right now. But that's certainly information that I can gather and have ready for the town meeting. Yeah.
Just on that point, I don't know if this answers the question or not, but during our informational sessions, we talked to a lot of business people in Norwood. And they all are looking for housing for their employees closer to their job. And I go back to something I've said a few times. If you're paying $2,000 a month for a single bedroom apartment in Waltham, you're gonna pay it in Norwood. And that's the norm. Nobody's putting $500 apartments up anymore. Wouldn't it be better to pay the $2,000 in Norwood and walk to work than to live in Waltham or Burlington and fight 128 every day And that's what these businesses are. And we've had many, well, including the hospital when they were first starting out. You know, I'm sure whoever takes it over, they're looking for places for their employees to live closer to where they work. And that takes more cars off the road. There's a lot of benefits to that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was a big thing from the business community in Norwood, that, boy, we need places for our people to work, to live closer to where they work.
Yeah, I would love those numbers. I understand.
Yeah,
that they're
absolutely.
available.
So just
I'll
to
check in
add
with
on
our
to Ernie's
economic
point real quick, it's hard, in a sense, it's hard to track because Moderna has more jobs at their campus than they did 5 years ago. But 10 years before that, that campus had more Putnam employees than it did just 5 years ago. And 30 or 40 years ago, when it was Raytheon, there were, sorry, there were thousands of jobs there. So it's sort of, it ebbs and flows with time. And then the hospital's an example. Are we technically down jobs because there's 1,000 hot jobs that were there that were lost in June? It's a hard number to track, but the area has also grown. That's something just one last point. I promise, Ed, we're going to you next. Norwood's grown and redeveloped. We're the same size we were 30 years ago, roughly the same population, the commercial base has changed. A lot of the towns around us are significantly larger than they were 30 or 40 years ago. They have larger commercial and industrial bases than they did. We've always been a mill town. We've been built out with a lot of commerce and industry for decades. A lot of the towns around us are much larger than they used to be too.
Water.
Ed, Ed Ferris?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So the first thing that came to mind to me that I need to ask about was, we're allowing for underground parking as an incentive. But the thing I'm not seeing anywhere in the article is, what are we doing about the water remediation, for runoff for underground parking? Because, over the past few years, global warming has shown, especially downtown, we do have a water problem we have to be concerned with. And, let's face it, half the town came out of Purgatory Swamp, 100 years ago, and we're still at that low level. So we have a very high water table.
The short answer, and I am not a drainage engineer, but the short answer is that by having more open space on the lot, which is achieved by structured parking and consolidating the parking in the building footprint, that does give you more space for stormwater management systems. So it gives you more space for retention basins and more sophisticated drainage mechanisms. And it also gives you more natural infiltration, much more vegetation on the site. So there's a definite stormwater management benefit to doing that.
I just wanted to jump in.
Yeah, honestly, I understand that, but it's not proactive. And that's the same problem that, happened in the new build district in South Boston, where you have wonderful, beautiful buildings all gone up and their parking garages all flood, because of storm surge. And there are no building codes for the garages themselves, which is why they're allowed to flood. So that was the only thing I would consider we're probably missing in this, because that's going to be a problem. What are they going to do? Put pumps in and then put them in the street?
All right, thank you for that. As promised, I know we have more questions. Let's chat afterwards. I just want to make sure we have enough time to get through all these
The state
articles.
talked to FEMA about the geography of the town. They changed the level to level 1 as FEMA flood zone. The state looked at that. Hey, we have to plug this in here, but we have a big flood. Sorry about the mill in the water, but still have it. It hasn't gone away.
So the state wouldn't let us put any of our district in certain excluded areas, and that did factor into account the flood maps. None of what's proposed here is in those affected areas. Okay. So this last article is about accessory dwelling units as a special residential use. An accessory dwelling unit is a unit of housing that is kind of auxiliary or ancillary to the primary dwelling. They're commonly known as in-law apartments. I'm told elsewhere in the world they call them granny flats, but I've never heard of anybody calling it that here. It's you're familiar with this, right? It's your finished basement. It's your small addition onto your home that has a small kitchen, bath, a bedroom or two. It is something that is often used by family members, for family members, but not exclusively. These types of units give homeowners some flexibility in how they use their properties. We've gotten feedback from residents that they'd like to be able to use these for caretakers, for people in their families who have disabilities, for their own family members, either, you know, parents, aging parents, or college kids moving back home, or being able to rent out these units to generate some sort of an income stream, to allow somebody to stay in a home in Norwood that maybe has become unaffordable to them. So these small units tend to have a lot of benefits. They have been constructed in Norwood for many years. This is not a new concept here. This is something that has been a part of Norwood's neighborhoods for a very long time, but the zoning bylaw is silent on them. We don't really have any regulations to control these and make sure that when they are constructed, they're done so safely with the right amount of egress, and that they are constructed in ways that don't really change the fundamentals of our residential neighborhoods. And, you know, this is helpful because after, you know, over a year of talking to people in Norwood about housing, you know, I've gotten to hear a lot of people talk about how important these single family neighborhoods are to them and the character of the neighborhoods where they live. And so being able to create regulations for ADUs that provide a safe legal pathway for these to be constructed, but also in ways that don't really change the feel of our neighborhoods and change the character of these homes from being single families, is important. So this bylaw, it's not a long one. It basically sets some size restrictions. It makes sure that the unit has to be smaller. Right now, as written before you, the size restriction is either 900 square feet or half of the gross floor area of the primary dwelling, whichever is smaller. And it also requires that there be 2 means of egress and any doors that are added to the property, whether it's a door in an addition or adding a door to like a finished basement or something like that. Doors have to face the side and the rear of the house. Again, preserving, you know, that kind of neighborhood feel of a single family home. It disallows restrictions based on family members, because that's not like a questionably legal thing for us to enforce in our regulations, and it doesn't restrict, you know, kind of the uses of those. They would be allowed in any of our residential districts. Clarifying questions on these?
Yeah, I just have one question. If you have a two-family, say you have a two-family in South Norwood, and you have a 2-car garage that's attached, will you make that a 3-unit now?
So it wouldn't be a 3-family because the design of that smaller ADU, it would be an ADU. It wouldn't be a 3-family. It would be smaller than either of the other
Well, I'm
units.
saying, I think this bylaw, whoever put it together, I think 900 square feet is very generous for an
Yeah.
accessory apartment. I mean, that's big.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, can I add a 3rd unit in a 2-car garage that's been empty for 50 years
You mean like converting the garage?
into a 3rd unit
Gotcha.
by right?
So the zoning bylaw doesn't really get into code enforcement. That's a Gary question, and that's a conversation you'd have when you're trying to get your building permits. This is really just about the use of whether or not you could have this smaller structure.
Well,
This
even
doesn't allow you to create a detached structure, so tiny
But
homes
even
and
in an
backyards
S1 district,
would not be permitted
with
here.
all these beautiful homes, are people gonna be converting garages to get that extra
A
income?
detached garage would not be allowed. So an ADU has to be either constructed within the existing footprint of the building or in an addition. But you couldn't do a tiny home or a detached structure like a pool house. Sounds fancier than a shed.
But I'm saying, in a
Or
a
detached
2-car
garage.
garage that's attached onto a.
If
a
it's
house,
attached,
you can go in,
potentially,
you could go in and file, and by right, you can get a permit.
if the egress faces the back, if it meets the size requirements, you know,
And it's not more
and
than
then
900.
of course you'd have to meet all of the code requirements under the building.
That you can, the accessory dwelling unit has to be, it's a dwelling unit within the dwelling unit, essentially, it's part of it. So to your example, if, whether it's an attached garage, it could be a split with a garage under. You could convert the space that is garage space legally to be residential space, provided you do it in accordance with the code, with regards to egress and so forth. And it could be designated as an accessory dwelling unit because it has a kitchen and a bath and a sleeping area, and it's within the single family dwelling unit, but it's isolated as well.
I understand. So you don't need a permit from the ZBA. You just apply for
If
your
you
building.
meet all of the requirements, this is a by right
Part of it.
process.
I understand. Okay, thank you.
Then it would fall to the building department because you would need a building permit
Right.
for the addition.
Yeah, and building department will review your plans and make sure that it complies with the requirements of the bylaw. So there's still a check here to make sure that there's compliance. It just doesn't go before a public board. Any other questions about this article?
Sarah, do you want to just mention the governor's proposed bill that would require this?
Yeah, so the Affordable Homes Act has been proposed by the governor. It's working its way through Beacon Hill right now. It would include a requirement that communities have to allow ADUs by right. So I don't know what that final language will look like if and when the state passes that law into being. I don't know if ours will be compliant with, what comes out of that. But I do think that this is a good protective move to make sure that we have our own legal avenue, defined clearly in our bylaws in advance of that. If something were required by state law to be allowed by right, then, we wouldn't necessarily have this addressed in our bylaw. It's good to have this addressed now to kind of eliminate the possibility that we'd be exposed, if that makes sense.
Just putting it out there that the state is looking to make another mandatory zoning change for cities and towns.
It's totally you.
Yeah, I just a question on the height of the ADU. Are there restrictions on the height?
So all of the standard restrictions that already apply to the single family home would continue to apply. So because it would be an addition to the existing home.
Right, so in my neighborhood, somebody added on, the height of the addition is higher than the main house. Because it's over a garage and they just built way up.
Right.
It
So
would still have to meet the
Huh?
height restriction for the district. It's 30 feet.
I'm sorry?
Average height for in residential districts is 30 feet.
That's the.
So you could have a house
That's
that's 25 feet, you could have an addition that's 5 feet higher.
Okay,
it's
that's
still
the
allowed.
restriction, 30 feet.
It depends on where it is, what the setback is. There's portions of the building that would be restricted to 15 feet if they're closer to the lot line. But the maximum height in residential districts is 30 feet, average grade.
And it's important to note that this is true of any addition you put on your home, whether it's got the kitchen and the bath to make it an ADU or not. We have had this conversation a fair amount with planning board. It was like, well, what if, everybody puts on ADUs and they're hideous? Like, well, everybody could put on additions and they could be hideous too. It's not really an ADU problem. The standard rules apply for any, residential construction. The only difference here is that, it would be a self-contained unit within a unit, but you wouldn't necessarily know that from the street.
So if somebody had put on an ADU, but they didn't have the required setback amount, do they still have the option to go to the ZBA for the ADU?
Again, that's the construction of the structure.
Okay.
So if the structure in and of itself, regardless of what it's used for, doesn't meet the zoning setback as required, then it would require relief from the ZBA. The use is irrelevant in that case. And this proposes that the use is allowed by right.
And just for clarification, what is it that triggers it being a separate dwelling unit versus just an addition with a wet bar or something like that?
Right.
What features do you have to have that suddenly it becomes a separate unit?
Definition of a dwelling unit includes kitchen, like cooking facilities, bathroom facilities, and living quarters. So the cooktop.
Yeah, well, yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
there's no regulation that limits the number of kitchens you can have in your house. You can have 5 kitchens in your house. You can have 10 bathrooms. The definition of a dwelling unit is an independent housekeeping unit with cooking, sleeping, and sanitary facilities utilized by one or more persons. So you could have one within another. That would be the accessory unit or attached to it.
if your
Still-
addition has a bedroom and a bathroom, and maybe even a living area, though, that's like a guest suite, that's not an ADU.
It's all those features together in a self-contained area.
Correct.
It walks like a duck.
But like I said, you could build the same structure, just not have a stove and it's not being used separately. From the outside, it looks the same.
Yeah, it would be the difference between a suite, which might have a bathroom and a bedroom and a living area, but no kitchen. That's not an ADU. That's just a suite within a single family home.
So the difference is really gonna be on the inside.
Correct.
Not on anything you see from the street.
Are there any other questions online? Anybody online have any other
Has the
questions?
planning board approved this yet, this article?
So the planning board voted to recommend it, obviously, for the placement on the warrant. So it is on the warrant. The planning board opened its public hearing. So for all of the other articles, the planning board opened its public hearing, heard testimony and comments, deliberated and recommended after closing the public hearing to recommend 5-0. ADUs, that hearing is still open. And so they heard a number of comments that they are considering responding to, or maybe coming up with some amendments to this to bring to the floor of town meeting. That is a possibility that always happens, you know, when you have the hearing open. So they're still kind of deliberating on whether or not they want to bring some recommended changes in response to the feedback that they heard in the public hearing.
So what we're seeing on the warrant right now could change.
It could change. It could change. And they've not made a formal recommendation on this at this moment. By town meeting, obviously, we'll have a little bit more clarity, but that's how the process works. I mean, it's the point of the public hearing, right? Is to be able to give yourself the chance to still be responsive to some of those concerns.
When is it expected that they'll just to be considerate to town meeting?
Yeah,
members,
sure.
they'll
So
know when they'll have.
their
final
hearing was
language?
continued to this coming Monday. And I think it's not unreasonable to think that there would be a vote at the end of the meeting on Monday. It wouldn't be like the night of, if it is. Oh my gosh. For my own sake, I'm pretty sure the planning board would not do that to me. But yeah, any changes, if the planning board wants to make a floor amendment, I'll think about putting together in some sort of a mailing so that you all have that ahead of time. We did that for the BPH, I think. We had some floor amendments that were made after the warrant was published, and we kind of sent that information out. So we'll work to make sure that town meeting members have as much information as soon as they can.
If this doesn't pass at town meeting, would the next step be to revise the plan based on the input and another town meeting, special town meeting held?
For MBTA, you mean?
You refer to the MBTA program?
Yes.
Yeah, we have until I think the end of December to legally comply. So I think if it didn't pass, we would have to rework it and bring it back at a future town meeting, whether that's in November at a regular scheduled town meeting or a special scheduled town meeting.
Have any other towns passed this?
Yes.
How many have complied so far?
Over a dozen.
More than a dozen have. Most are in some process of compliance.
Can I just ask, can this go on the ballot?
No,
Can it go
town
on a
meeting.
townwide ballot?
Town meeting has to pass this. There's always, options that vary by town for, a referendum to be held to overturn a decision of town meeting. That's what happened in Milton. But this is really town meetings up or down.
To be quite candid,
It has
you're
to
an
be.
elected town meeting member, you're elected to make these decisions. So saying, let's just put it to a ballot initiative is the ultimate sort of punt it to somebody else to make the decisions. That will really one of town meeting's most important authorities is regulating land use.
But I understand that, but as an elected town meeting member, you represent the people in your neighborhood. And if the majority of them don't understand why we're including 74 acres instead of 50, it's kind of like my job to explain why we're doing that. So I kind of feel like.
I mean, I can
That's
help.
exactly what it
That's
is.
my job too.
The way I feel we should comply with the law. It's the law. I mean, I don't want to pay my excise tax, but I have to because that's the law. We need to follow the law, but I also feel like, as someone said earlier, is it overkill? And I think that's what we're going to be bracing for a storm at town meeting over those two words.
I appreciate your comments. To Madam Moderator's point, does anybody have any more clarifying questions? We'll have plenty of time for debate at town meeting. But do you have more clarifying questions on the articles?
Could you go back to the slide where you showed the 3 different districts?
Oh,
Yes. while I'm scrolling. What's your,
There you
what's
go.
your question?
All right, the Windsor Gardens district, so the proposed overlay district is the blue hatching.
Yes.
The existing multifamily district is the gold underneath it.
Uh-huh.
That Windsor Gardens, that was what Windsor Gardens was built on, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It looks like they don't exactly align.
They do.
Okay.
They do. I promise.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see blue hatching without gold underneath it. I see gold without blue hatching.
Yeah, no, I will look into making sure that the final map is perfection. It's a direct overlay on the property that is currently zoned for multifamily underlying and then also owned and operated as Windsor Gardens. That tiny triangle by the train tracks is owned by the MBTA. And that little land over there is all wetlands anyway. So like functionally, it wouldn't change anything if it were wrong, but it is a direct overlay.
And then just to be clear on the North Central District, there's, I think we refer to it as the Beaver Pole land, behind Auto Doctor there. So that land is going to be in this overlay district and also in hospital medical district as well.
Yeah.
So I know there's some concern about could you build, that this would prevent accessory uses for the hospital, but
Yeah.
you could do that too.
Yeah, so this is your question about how they layer,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so this is a really good illustration of that. So the parcel that's closest to the train tracks that's owned by the hospital, that's fully manufacturing, but the parcel next to it where Auto Doctor is located, that one is actually a split lot. So some of that is zoned as general business underlying, and some of it is zoned as manufacturing. So we've got rules about how that operates on a single parcel. There's a medical services overlay district on top of that that would allow development for particular medical related uses. And then this would be another option. All it is options. It just adds a whole different set of available uses, you know, for the market to pursue if and when there's a demand for it.
And the MBTA overlay district allows multi-use, and one of the multi-uses that allowed there would be medical offices as well. So you could actually do residence and medical offices.
Correct.
Even under that district. So
Yes.
okay, that was intentional, I assume.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
I think Alan had a question.
Thank you. A couple of things. First of all, I get it that the numbers are really theoretical. I mean, nobody's going to tear down Millwood Crossing or Avalon tomorrow. Having said that, I can go at 50. I understand the rationale for that. I think, you know, we certainly want to, you know, do things in accordance with the state law. What I personally have an issue with is 78, and the reason for that is that we're in the process of going out doing a master plan. And to me, if we're going to be doing a master plan, which who knows what the master plan, you know, is going to say. They say the same things as you're talking about now, but we don't know that. So I would prefer that we go with 50. See what happens with the master plan, and then let the chips fall as they may.
Is that a question, Mr. Slater?
Is it a question?
You phrased it in the way of a question.
Agree for thought.
Yeah, food for thought, noted, right? I mean, the people's
That's
opinions on
noted.
this are going to vary. I think the task force felt strongly, you know, that it didn't want to waste our time, right? It wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to engage in the public in exactly the same way. I mean, you're on the master plan steering committee. You know, this process is very similar of engaging with the public and really kind of identifying priorities, talking with the community. I mean, we engaged in that process to be able to come to this point. So I don't personally see this as an aggressive kind of piece of land use policy that would be superseding or contradictory in any way to the results of the master plan. The master plan may say, let's go in a different direction with these general areas, and we can do that. Like zoning never ends, right? We're always long range planning. We're always looking at our bylaw and finding ways to make change. I personally don't feel that the prospect of doing a master plan at some point in the near or far future should stop us from planning now. But either way, that was something that the task force and the planning board talked about, and this is the direction we went in. So noted, I fully respect that point of view.
Okay, well,
but
yeah.
this is what we're proposing.
I get it. I know what you're saying. I mean, I happen to disagree. And I think if you're looking to get something done in town meeting, I mean, you've heard what some people have said, and you've heard it all. I mean, you know, certainly more than what you heard today.
What have you got?
However, you know, I think if you want to get something through town meeting, you do the minimum. Don't give anyone an excuse to vote something down. And if you do the minimum, which is 50, with 44 units per acre, you satisfy both the acreage requirement as well as the housing requirement. To me, 50 is the way to go.
And that's fair.
If you're gonna do the 50, which 28 acres do you take out? I don't see how that, you know,
Is it the sentiment?
Just to,
they did so much planning around this.
Is it the sentiment of
just
the
to,
town?
Mr. Slater's comment, we did that on the Uptown overlay district. And we thought about that long and hard when we proposed that to the town. What would be the appetite for town meeting for the Uptown? And I think we went with 32 units per acre, and nothing has got done. And one little building on Day Street, you know, nothing has got, because it's come back to us that it's not feasible. And so at some point, we're gonna go back to the town to change the density on the Uptown overlay, because it didn't spark any, just for an example, I'll give you an example. Olivati's, beautiful building, I use this all the time, 44 units per acre is the density there. I mean, so it's, I mean, so I tried that with the Uptown, it didn't work. I understand your point, you want it to pass. Yeah. But going back to my other point, I think we looked at this as a task force planning board, and we really talked and we said, this is an opportunity for us to do it right. Take the parcels that are ripe for redevelopment, that are perfectly put for on the train tracks, vacant land that would be changed to a new vibrant entity with, you know, new stormwater management systems, new everything. People gonna walk to work, walk to the train, support all the businesses downtown. All these things came in, and that's what we came up with. I get it. I totally understand. You know, we had this, I mean, it was a lot of deliberation over what will pass town meeting and what we should really do what we thought this was the best thing for the town.
Okay, thank you.
All right, one more, and you're it.
Just a question about how this will come before town meeting. There are 3 separate space, like prop zones with slightly different rules for each. So will that be 3 independent votes at town meeting?
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
It'll be voting on each article, but I'll let
Yeah,
the
I
moderator-
mean, this one, the motions are gonna be the key. And
Right.
obviously, we will be consulting with council on exactly how these motions need. So where the article just introduces everything, the specific motions will address. So maybe.
So that hasn't been decided yet.
Has not been decided.
And it'll be a challenging one for us to, like, that's gonna be a long motions meeting, because compliance, even though we've got sub-districts and there's multiple sections, like I said, that compliance model, I mean, it's the equation, it's a whole, right? So it would be challenging to just remove one sub-district and still have something that we could say confidently, yeah, this is going to comply. So we'll have our calculators on hand at town meeting if that comes up, but in reality, that would be very difficult. So the motions meeting will be an interesting one. We'll stay tuned. All right. Thank you so much. I wanted to let you know we do have
One more.
one more.
Never looking at the computer.
And we are looking at the computer. There have been honestly 5 or 6 hands at a time up in the room, but I guess we can take one more call.
I just need one simple question answered because I've already had it asked to me.
All right, Ed, you never
What's
asked
the maximum density per type?
Per acre?
No, maximum density per acre, but you said there's variations based on what you're allowing, you know, if you have mixed use
Okay.
building, if you're allowing underground parking, so on and so forth. So there has to be a type there. We're lost in the weeds right now. The question I need to get is, what is the maximum? Because that's what I'm getting asked.
Yep, so there is none. The average density that's allowed. Again, if you're building out to the maximum of all of these, the dimensional requirements, it's about 44 units an acre. It's slightly higher in the Norwood Depot. And the reason for that is the front setback is not as deep because it's downtown, right? Your buildings are right by the sidewalk. So that density is higher. The density in Norwood Central and Windsor Gardens is kind of about the same. It's lower than it's like in the low 30s.
Okay, that's what I needed. Thank you.
You bet. All right, so we have, for anybody who wants to talk a little bit more or engage with me kind of in a more informal setting, we do have one more MBTA informational session. That's an online open mic night on March 11th at 7 p.m. The Google Meet link to that is on our website. So I encourage you to come to that if you just want to spitball on MBTA. I'm here for it. I'm also obviously in the office 40 hours a week. You are all welcome to call, drop by, email. I'd love to talk to each of you individually more about this. Anybody in my department is ready and prepared to do that with you. Otherwise, we will see you at town meeting. Thank you for coming.
So,